you'll, while swapping mics so that Roger can stand up. So this is Darwinian evolution, not Big Bang. This is thinking about maybe a collaborative or managed market. But there's also a strong message in Owen's paper, and I'd be interested to know Roger's view on this, that so far much of the efforts around aid reform have sort of focused around good intentions rather than a desire to radically change the rules of the game around which aid is provided. Does Owen convince you that there is an alternative?
I'll tell you in a moment.
Okay.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Alison. I'm delighted to be here to talk about this very important paper. In a rather odd situation, because I have read the paper a couple of times, none of you have, so that some of the things I say may be a little mysterious to you until you read it, but I hope that what I have to say will encourage you to take it away with you and read it, because it deserves to be read. There are 5 reasons why I think this paper is important. Firstly, because it blends support for aid with an analysis of some major problems that aid has. Now, this may seem an odd thing to say, but the fact that this is done is noteworthy, because all too often supporters of aid spend their time defending it, and critics of aid are those that conclude that aid is no good, as Owen has indicated with someone like Dambisa Moyo. The next thing we need to do is to see far more of the aid agencies themselves highlighting the sorts of problems that Owen has provided in his paper. Second important thing is that this is focusing on political economy. My view is strongly that you cannot look at aid unless you look at the political dimensions of aid as well as the economic. Thirdly, I think this paper needs to be read and looked at because of the discussion and analysis of aid through the prism of institutional economics. It's enlightening, it's helpful, it urges a more explicit and holistic approach to what is called the collective market, with a rich selection of ideas, some original and imaginative, for ways forward. What is of more importance is that the paper also puts up a convincing case of why donors should pay attention to the ideas in the paper. There are, fourthly, a large number of recommendations, some of which I will reflect a little on in a moment. And finally, I very much like the paper's emphasis on drawing the reader's attention to the importance of aid recipients. 2 instances are worth highlighting. He writes, developing countries demand that aid should be delivered better and more responsive to their priorities. And a little later, the country-led approach places developing countries at the forefront of the development process. Aid should support the development of the country's own legitimate and accountable institutions. However, I guess the main purpose of my being here is not to praise, but to raise questions, so I will now do that. My first question concerns the terrain of political economy. In practice, the paper's focus is on official aid agencies, examining changes that take place within them, talking about internal incentive structures. Indeed, in places I read the paper as seeming to suggest that it's fruitless to look for pressure points of change elsewhere. This is a wrong interpretation, then perhaps it needs to be made clearer. If I'm correct in understanding the paper, then I think its analysis is too narrow. For me, the political economy of aid needs to include and embrace analysis of what is happening well beyond the agencies that deliver aid. Bilateral agencies in particular are agencies of particular governments, and the source of origin of key problems of aid and donor practices can be located not within agencies, but at the door of their political masters. For instance, allocation decisions are profoundly influenced by short-run political decisions of major governments. Likewise, aid's volatility and unpredictability, and the fact that aid giving remains from a development perspective fundamentally flawed because it's based to this day on a voluntary choice of whether to give it or not, are at heart issues for politicians and not predominantly internal issues that can be settled by the agencies themselves. The way that states perceive their international obligations and how these ought to be addressed has a direct influence on the political economy of aid, a subject of vigorous debate. The backdrop and bread and butter of this debate comprise international treaties, protocols, conventions, binding agreements, international conferences and summits, and the actions and activities of international lawyers and lobby groups. The area is fast changing. I remember at a public meeting here at ODI 20 years ago where the Tobin tax was dismissed as hot air and politically naive. Now it's being taken forward as something politically possible and indeed as desirable. For me, therefore, the political economy of aid needs to embrace both what is happening within agencies and what is happening and why outside. The paper focuses predominantly on aid agencies and the process by which agencies might change and move forward, as suggested in the paper. Owen outlines a couple of reasons why it could be perceived to be in the interests of donors to move towards a collaborative market. But the question is how and why. Let me take one example. A central and pivotal recommendation that he gives is this. As an immediate first step, aid could be completely untied. That is, contracts would not be restricted to individuals and organizations from the donor country. As I read it, many of the proposals flow from this, such as his ideas about moving to explicit contracts, unbundling, and the introduction of procurement mechanisms. My question is this: why should donors choose to untie their aid now, when for decades and today, many remain reluctant to do so? What is the internal mechanism within aid agencies that might persuade them to do so? The paper doesn't spell out the process sufficiently, in my view, ways in which current practice could change. Now I want to move on to some of the other recommendations. I mentioned earlier that for me a particular strength of the paper lies in the way it draws attention to the key role and importance of recipient countries. As you know, recipient country ownership is one of the centerpieces of the Paris Declaration. The Declaration flags the importance of donors working together to build up the strength and capacity of recipient countries so that it is they, rather than the donors, who make the crucial decisions and decide where aid will be used, and it is they and not the donors in the Declaration who will play the pivotal role in terms of coordination of aid and aid agencies. Against this backdrop, it seems surprising to me that the recommendations made are donor-focused, comprising discussions of how and why donors might act differently. To me, what donors need urgently to do is to work together to help build and strengthen the capacity of recipient countries. And I think if they can do so, they can then act more in terms of regulators and helping the the market to operate more effectively, which is what Owen is advocating. We have on the slide here the issue of political equilibrium. And I'd just like to make a comment here. In the discussion that we had earlier with Alison, she also noted that the equilibrium issue is important. Owen writes as follows: if the aid system reflects an equilibrium that balances the interests of donors and recipients, then reforms will be sustainable if they shift the equilibrium. Efforts simply to move away from the equilibrium will not succeed for long, if at all. My own reading of the history of aid is that suggests that in the aid relationship over time, donors as a group have become far more powerful than recipients. My view is that in recent years especially, the balance of power between donors and recipients has shifted decisively and significantly in favour of donors. Is it the view of the paper that this reading of history is wrong? Is it the paper's view that for the reforms proposed to work, the current balance between donors and recipients should remain broadly unaltered? I believe that some clarification is needed on this point. I welcome the paper's recommendations on information sharing and transparency. I think that's a very powerful mover to get some of the recommendations that Owen has put forward more on the agenda and action taken. There are, however, two specific recommendations that I think need further discussion. The first concerns investing in what he calls mechanisms for beneficiaries to provide feedback. Unless I haven't read the paper carefully enough, wherever the paper mentions beneficiaries, it does so in the context of service delivery. The strong impression conveyed is that for the purpose of all, if official aid is provided, is to provide resources which one way or another will have an effect on and reach down eventually to poor people. Now, while much official aid does this, a growing and now significant share does not. As we know, official aid is now widely used to help address governance problems, build capacities of both governments and civil society organizations. Hence, a large share of aid is not provided for service delivery, and those who receive it are not the ultimate beneficiaries, but the governments. Second recommendation that I think merits further consideration is one suggesting that funding for international organizations be linked to results. I welcome the recent emphasis placed on results. However, I think it remains essential to distinguish between managing for results and shifting attention beyond inputs and outputs to outcomes, which I strongly support too, and funding by results. It is the latter which the paper focuses on, and this raises concerns for me. The problem with trying to provide a direct link between aid inputs and broad development outcomes is that, as we know, outcomes are attributable to a whole range of different influences, of which aid is only one. The relationship between one donor's contribution to aggregate outcomes becoming even more difficult to trace. Final recommendation I wish to comment on is the one that calls for more independent, transparent, rigorous, and comparable evaluations of aid interventions. This brings me back to what I believe the most central issue for improving aid effectiveness, namely how to initiate change. I certainly believe that there is a need for more and better evaluations, including more independent evaluations, and also believe that more should be done to reduce the commissioning of evaluations by one agency, which duplicates and overlaps those with others, which Owen highlights as a weakness in his paper. However, for me, far more priority ought to be given to two further issues. One is building the capacity of recipients to undertake their own evaluations, ensuring, too, that they are involved in decisions by donors of what to evaluate. The other is the need to lean on donors to encourage them to adopt a far more critical and less defensive attitudes to evaluations. Good evaluations are often able to highlight problems of aid interventions and the gap between objectives and what's happening in practice. But senior managers within aid agencies need to champion evaluation and encourage critical comments, because this provides a far more supported context for lesson learning. But I believe they are unlikely to do so without external prodding. This view is based particularly on my own experience over the past 2 years as a member of the Independent Advisory Committee on Development Impact, charged with assuring the independence and quality of evaluation. I believe the committee has acted as a significant external catalyst to shift thinking about evaluation with DFID, and for DFID to accept and to begin to operationalize some of the proposals that Owen is talking about. All that said, let me return to where I began. Owen needs to be congratulated on having provided an insightful and I think extremely helpful contribution towards improving the effectiveness of aid. I hope his ideas are considered by the aid agencies to whom they're directed, but more especially I think they will receive traction if they're considered by the OECD DAC, where they have the greatest potential to have an impact at the donor-wide level, although that suggests that I'm in favour of planning.